It begins with silence. Not the peaceful kind that follows a snowfall, but the heavy, humming quiet of a place too deep for sound to travel. If you dive far enough beneath the blue-gray surface of Lake Mead, America's largest reservoir, there are moments when light vanishes before you do. Down there, where silt drifts like ash through motionless water, the outlines of something human emerge. A roofline, a church spire, the corner of a courthouse window still framed in rusted iron. What lies beneath that water is not debris from the dam's construction or relics of forgotten cabins. It is an entire county. Streets, records, graves, and stories that once had its own flag and courthouse seal. The vanished county of St. Thomas, Nevada, was supposed to fade quietly when the Colorado River was dammed in 1935, but the silence beneath Lake Mead still whispers the truth. America tried to bury underwater. In the early 1930s, the desert was not a place for optimism. The Great Depression had spread like a dust storm across the plains, and the federal government was desperate to prove it could build something, anything, that restored faith in progress. Hoover Dam, then called Boulder Dam, was to be the ultimate promise. It would tame the river, electrify the West, and employ thousands. But before the first dynamite charge ever cracked the canyon's walls, surveyors discovered a complication. Hundreds of families already living along the floodplain. Most were descendants of Mormon settlers who had arrived decades earlier, when Nevada was barely a territory. They had built a county that few outside the region even knew existed. The narrator's voice lowers, slow and steady. St. Thomas wasn't meant to be remarkable. That's what made it perfect to erase. St. Thomas sat on a bend where the muddy river met the Colorado. From a distance, it was a streak of green against red rock. Cottonwoods lined the edges of irrigation ditches, and clapboard homes shimmered in the heat like white ghosts. By the 1910s, it had its own schoolhouse, post office, and a one-room jail. There was a single paved road connecting the settlement to the mining camps to the north. But the geography that made the county fertile also made it doomed to St. Thomas. Every spring, floods from the Colorado pushed against the muddy's narrow banks. When federal engineers mapped out the area for the new dam, St. Thomas appeared not as a town, but as an obstacle. A patch of private land sitting squarely in what would become the lake bed. By 1931, letters began arriving at the St. Thomas Courthouse. Each bore the same header: Department of the Interior, Bureau of Reclamation. The letters didn't threaten. They informed. The people of St. Thomas would have to leave. The federal government had purchased the valley, and in time, it would be underwater. At first, no one believed it. Locals called the officials "dam men," and their blueprints seemed as fanciful as the stories of cities under the sea. When one engineer named Frank Crow arrived to take measurements near the county school, a farmer named Edward Fenton reportedly laughed in his face. "You really think you'll get enough water in that river to drown a county?" he said. Crow didn't answer. He simply pointed to the horizon. It was the first time many of them realized that the plan wasn't theory, it was geometry. The waterline on the map passed right through their church. By 1932, government assessors began offering compensation for the land. The offers were low. A family's entire farm might be valued at $300, less than the cost of moving the livestock out of the valley. Still, some took the deal. Others refused. Sheriff records from 1933 show that 6 property owners in St. Thomas declined federal payment entirely. They were not just holding out for more money. They believed the dam would never fill. A woman named Margaret Reese wrote in her journal, "They cannot flood a county that was built by God's river hands. We have lived through drought and dust and death. A wall cannot hold the desert." That line would later appear in newspaper columns decades after the lake rose, cited as the voice of defiance that echoed all the way to Washington. The Bureau of Reclamation wasn't interested in argument. To the government, progress was arithmetic. The dam would hold back more than 2 million acre-feet of water. St. Thomas sat exactly 2 feet below the projected surface level. So the Bureau began clearing the valley. Homes were surveyed, photographed, and marked with white paint for demolition. Churches were stripped of their stained glass. Graves were relocated to the hills. Even the cottonwoods were cut down to prevent boat hazards when the water finally came. What remains remarkable is how quietly it happened. There were no mass protests, no lawsuits that reached the Supreme Court. The country was too tired from Depression-era hunger to fight for a few hundred desert settlers. The newspapers called it a necessary sacrifice. And in the dry autumn of 1934, the last freight wagon rolled out of St. Thomas. Or so the officials thought. For almost a year, one man refused to leave. His name was Hugh Lord, a rancher whose property bordered the old courthouse lot. When everyone else packed up, he stayed behind with his mule and a kerosene lamp. Reporters called him the last man in St. Thomas. He told them, "When the water touches my porch, I'll leave." That line made the Associated Press. It was printed coast to coast, a curious story about stubborn American grit. Few realized how literal he was. By June 1938, the waters of Lake Mead had reached the valley. Lord watched as the fields where he had planted alfalfa turned to mirror. He moved his bed to the roof of his house. For weeks, he rode to town on a makeshift raft to buy food. Then, one morning, he burned his house down, climbed into his boat, and paddled away as the flames reflected on the rising lake. When a reporter asked him why, he said, "So no one else could claim I left anything behind." After that, the name St. Thomas disappeared from government maps. County records were absorbed by Clark County. The post office shuttered. Children who had grown up along the muddy river scattered to Las Vegas or Salt Lake City. Within 2 years, Lake Mead was full. Boats floated above what had been Main Street. Fishermen would occasionally snag something unusual: roof shingles, fence posts, even the corner of a sign that once read St. Thomas Mercantile. And yet, not everything stayed buried. In the late 1940s, when water levels dropped during the drought, the town re-emerged for the first time. Locals who had moved away drove back, parking on the cracked mud to see what was left. The remains were eerie: chimney stacks protruding from the earth like gravestones, walls warped by the heat, traces of white paint marking the last homes scheduled for demolition. Children played among the ruins. Someone carved their initials into the foundation of the old schoolhouse. But before long, the rains returned, and the water swallowed it again. The narrator's tone shifts, lower, reflective. There's a strange truth about erasure. When you bury something completely, you also preserve it. Every time Lake Mead's levels receded, St. Thomas came back slightly more intact than before. Its adobe walls hardened underwater, sealed from oxygen. The old courthouse foundation remained square. Even the concrete steps to the school were still in place. But that persistence created problems for the government. By the 1950s, St. Thomas had become a curiosity. Tourists wanted to dive there. Reporters wanted to photograph it. The National Park Service, which now managed the area, discouraged exploration. Officially, they said it was dangerous due to unstable sediment. Unofficially, there were other reasons. Internal memos obtained decades later would show that the Bureau of Reclamation wanted the town minimized in public interpretation. The dam was supposed to be a symbol of triumph, not displacement. One historian wrote, "You can't celebrate progress and mourn its victims at the same site." And yet, the ghosts of that county wouldn't stay silent. Through the 1960s and 70s, divers from nearby universities began unauthorized surveys of the lake bed. What they found contradicted official records. Beneath the layers of silt, there were not just homes but full civic structures, vaults, safes, even preserved legal documents. The courthouse's basement, once thought cleared, still held ledgers from property disputes and criminal cases dated as late as 1934. Some pages were remarkably legible. One entry read, "Case number 241, State Vitauzuem. Haskins, trespass and unlawful claim to government land." It was stamped, "Dismissed, jurisdiction void upon transfer of county authority." Plain terms, the local court had been dissolved before its final cases could conclude. That meant the property seizures leading up to the flooding were never fully adjudicated. Legally, St. Thomas's last county proceedings were left open. That revelation would later fuel a small movement among descendants, people who claimed the government still owed them compensation for improperly processed land titles. But at the time, those discoveries were quietly suppressed. The divers' reports were never published. Funding for further expeditions was denied. The lake covered the truth again, but it didn't stay quiet for long. In 1983, a severe drought dropped Lake Mead's waterline by more than 100 feet. Photographers from National Geographic and the Los Angeles Times rushed to capture what had surfaced. The outlines of streets, school steps, and dozens of stone foundations. The images went viral long before that word existed. Suddenly, America saw the skeleton of a vanished county, the physical evidence of what progress had erased. That same year, an elderly woman named Helen Lord, daughter of the last man in St. Thomas, returned to the site. A local journalist recorded her walking through the mud with a cane, tracing the outline of her childhood home. When asked what she remembered most, she said softly, "Silence. It's the same silence now as it was when the water came, like the world took a deep breath and never exhaled." Her quote would appear in an exhibit years later, but her words captured what every historian of St. Thomas eventually realized. The story wasn't just about a town drowned by water. It was about how the country decided which stories were worth keeping above the surface. By the 1990s, the Park Service began to change its stance. Guided tours were allowed during drought years. A single sign marked the site: St. Thomas, founded 1865, abandoned 1938. But even that simplicity hid a deeper truth. The sign omitted that the county, not just the town, had been dissolved without a final vote. Clark County officials had quietly absorbed its records, assets, and even its debts, creating an administrative merger that erased the entity of St. Thomas County entirely. There are historians today who argue that, technically, the county still exists on paper, unresolved, submerged, but never legally dissolved through state legislation. If true, that would make St. Thomas the only American county whose borders lie fully underwater, yet remain active in legal limbo. The narrator pauses, The sound of lapping water fades into the hum of wind across empty desert. Progress in America often comes with a price tag, but every once in a while, that price floats back to the surface. In 2002, the drought returned worse than ever. Lake Mead reached its lowest level since the dam's construction. The ghost town of St. Thomas was fully exposed again, this time to a generation raised on digital cameras and internet forums. People posted images of crumbling walls and iron bed frames under captions like, "The Atlantis of Nevada." Archaeologists documented everything: the precise layout of streets, the remnants of irrigation pipes, even the shallow depressions that once marked graves. For the first time, researchers could map the entire vanished county in 3 dimensions. That digital reconstruction revealed something strange. St. Thomas's Civic Center was aligned almost perfectly with the later construction lines of the dam's service roads, a symmetry that suggested the Bureau's planners had used the existing settlement grid to orient their own infrastructure. In other words, the town they erased had guided the geometry of the dam that replaced it. It's here that the story shifts from nostalgia to unease. Because when researchers compared early Bureau maps to the final construction blueprints, they found inconsistencies. Survey points labeled displacement zone overlapped with parcels never properly acquired. Property transfer receipts were missing, and in one folder marked County Records Disposal, Authorized, half the pages had been torn out. One memo from 1934, discovered in the National Archives decades later, read, "Expedite clearance of all remaining tracts. Do not delay dam schedule for unresolved claims. Proceed as instructed." The signature was illegible, but the implication was clear. Some of St. Thomas wasn't purchased, it was taken. And when the lake rose, it covered not just homes, but the evidence. Today, when the waterline drops, you can still walk down what was once Main Street. The desert heat curls off the mud, and the smell of salt and decay clings to your clothes. There's a strange quiet there. No birds, no insects, just wind scraping against the old foundations. Visitors often describe the same eerie sensation, hearing the faint echo of church bells or the creak of wood from a building that hasn't stood in 80 years. Scientists explain it as auditory mirage, sound traveling across the canyon walls. But locals who've lived near the lake all their lives say it's something else. They say the county still remembers. Every so often, pieces of that memory wash ashore. A glass bottle with embossed lettering from the St. Thomas Mercantile, a license plate from 1936, fragments of dishes once used in the town cafe. Park rangers catalog them carefully, tagging each artifact as part of submerged cultural resources. The name feels clinical, but to those who once belonged to that valley, it's an acknowledgement, a small sign that history, no matter how deeply buried, refuses to stay drowned. The camera would pan across the cracked lake bed, then tilt upward toward the dam's concrete face, a monument both to progress and to forgetting. The narrator's closing words settle like dust over water. Beneath every reservoir lies a trade between what we build and what we bury. And sometimes, the past doesn't sink. It waits. The desert has a way of keeping secrets until it decides not to. When the waters of Lake Mead began to recede again in the early 2000s, the bones of the vanished county came back into view. Cracked adobe, warped iron, fragments of kitchenware. But this time, the re-emergence caught the attention of more than tourists and locals. It drew historians, archivists, and investigators who wanted to understand how an entire county could disappear, not just from the map, but from the record books. Among them was a man named Dr. Alan Merrick, a soft-spoken historian from the University of Utah, whose specialty was land transfers in the American West. He had grown up hearing about St. Thomas from his grandmother, who used to tell stories about the county that drowned to make the lights glow in Los Angeles. In 2004, Merrick applied for a research grant to study the submerged settlements along the Colorado River basin. He didn't expect what he found buried in the microfilm archives of the Bureau of Reclamation in Denver. There was a folder labeled St. Thomas County Transition, 1934, he said later in an interview, except the file was almost empty. Only one letter remained, and it wasn't signed. The letter read, "All remaining tracts to be resolved by direct clearance. Jurisdiction transfer complete. Physical assets to be documented and archived per instruction MB. No county seal. No author. No follow-up documentation." To a historian, the absence of detail was louder than the text itself. Merrick began tracing the chain of command that oversaw the dam's construction. At the top was the Bureau of Reclamation, under Commissioner Elwood Mead, the man for whom the lake was named. Below him, regional engineers, survey teams, and property acquisition officers handled the removal of local settlements. But the deeper Merrick dug, the more inconsistencies appeared. Some purchase orders were signed by names that didn't match the official employee roles. Entire blocks of transactions for the St. Thomas area were stamped confidential, Federal Infrastructure Reserve. Reserve of what? He muttered in one of his audio notes. The phrase didn't appear anywhere else in bureau language. At first, he assumed it was a clerical placeholder, a bureaucratic quirk. But when he compared the coordinates listed in those restricted tracts with old maps, he noticed something strange. The locations weren't random. They formed a rough rectangle about a mile wide, centered on what had once been the St. Thomas Courthouse. Whatever the Bureau had done before the flooding, they had drawn an invisible box around the county's civic center. To understand what that meant, Merrick traveled to Las Vegas, where many of St. Thomas's displaced families had resettled. In a sun-faded retirement home near Henderson, he met 89-year-old Ruth Hammond, granddaughter of the first postmaster of St. Thomas. Her memory wandered, but one story she recalled with perfect clarity. She said her father had been hired to help move county archives out of the courthouse before the water came. "They said take the files to Overton," she told Merrick. But halfway there, the truck was stopped by two men in suits. They took the boxes and told him to drive back. Merrick asked if her father ever saw those men again. "Never," she said. He called them the Washington Boys. When he pressed for more detail, she leaned closer. There was something else. He said the boxes were heavier than paper, like they had metal inside. At the time, Merrick thought little of it, but in his field notes, he underlined a single phrase: metal inside. It would take him years to understand what that meant. Meanwhile, the drought deepened. By 2006, Lake Mead's shoreline had receded so dramatically that even the old highway leading into St. Thomas was visible. Tourists could walk the same path that farmers once used to haul cotton into town. The Park Service began documenting the ruins more carefully, using laser scanning to map the structures. Merrick joined one of those teams as an observer. One afternoon, while mapping the foundation of the courthouse, a technician noticed an unusual anomaly in the subsurface readings. The ground directly beneath the building showed a metallic density inconsistent with stone or concrete. It wasn't large, roughly the size of a desk, but it reflected back at a frequency typical of steel containment. They thought it might be an old safe. When permission came through to excavate, the crew dug less than 4 feet before hitting something solid. It wasn't a safe. It was a box, rectangular, corroded, and sealed with riveted iron bands. Inside were 2 smaller boxes, one empty, one filled with partially intact metal canisters the size of film reels. The canisters had no markings, except for a faint stamp that read, USDEPT, of Interior, Arch, Resbosdivit. The Park Service cataloged it as an archival artifact of unknown origin. But Merrick took photographs, noting the pattern of corrosion and the numbering along the rim. Later, when he compared them to historical documents, he realized the code corresponded to a classification used by the Bureau in 1930. One reserved for topographic imaging and aerial reconnaissance. In other words, before the flooding, the Bureau had taken high-resolution aerial images of St. Thomas, stored them in sealed metal film reels, and then buried them beneath the courthouse itself. Why? That became the central question of Merrick's next decade. The simplest explanation was bureaucratic, backup storage. But there were problems with that theory. First, the dam's construction blueprints were meticulously preserved in Washington, not buried in the desert. Second, the use of steel containment boxes for film was expensive and unusual for the 1930s. And finally, the coordinates on the reels didn't match standard aerial mapping grids. When Merrick enhanced the first legible frame from one of the corroded reels in 2009, he noticed a faint series of white dots forming lines across the floodplain, lines not present in any official survey map. They converged on a single rectangular plot just north of the town. At that location, the original county assessor's notes from 1929 listed only one thing: unclaimed property, use unknown. Merrick had stumbled onto something buried long before the dam existed. The next piece came from an unexpected source, a retired Bureau archivist named Tom McHenry, who had worked at the Hoover Dam Visitor Center in the 1980s. When Merrick contacted him, McHenry laughed. "You're not the first to ask about St. Thomas," he said. "We used to get letters every few years from people claiming the government flooded more than a town." "What did they mean?" Merrick asked. McHenry hesitated. "Rumors, mostly. That there were tests done out there in the late 1920s, geological ones, or maybe something to do with mineral deposits. Some even said there was an old federal vault." Merrick asked if he'd ever seen proof. McHenry sighed. "No proof, just stories passed around between engineers. But there was one thing. Back when I worked the archives, there was a missing ledger. It was marked STC Vault Acquisition, 1932. No one knew what vault meant. It vanished from inventory years before I started." That word, vault, matched the classification code stamped on one of the reels. Now Merrick wasn't looking at a metaphor. He was chasing a literal vault that once existed within the borders of St. Thomas County. To understand why a vault might have been built in the middle of nowhere, he turned to the larger context. In the late 1920s, before the dam's approval, the federal government had been quietly surveying the entire Colorado Plateau for mineral and strategic resources. These surveys weren't publicized. They were tied to defense planning. Uranium, vanadium, and copper deposits were in demand for the nation's growing industrial and military interests. One internal memorandum from 1928, unearthed decades later, mentioned experimental repositories for mineral samples and assay data along the lower Colorado drainage. Such repositories were to be secured under existing territorial jurisdictions to minimize disclosure. If one of those repositories, essentially a classified storage vault, had been built within St. Thomas County, it would explain the Bureau's urgency to erase the region completely once the dam project began. Flooding the valley would guarantee permanent concealment. The more Merrick uncovered, the stranger the story grew. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the vault acquisition ledger and related correspondence. Most came back with the same response: no records found. But one partial scan arrived by mistake. 3 pages of an index listing that referenced STC Repository 14B. Contents: mineral samples, technical correspondence, and unprocessed imaging plates. The date? March 3, 1932, 3 years before Hoover Dam's completion. It suggested that the federal government had stored something under the county seat, then deliberately flooded it. Merrick published his preliminary findings in an academic journal in 2010. The paper caused minor controversy, but gained little mainstream attention. Skeptics argued that his interpretation relied on incomplete data. The Bureau of Reclamation issued a brief statement calling his conclusions unsupported by available evidence. But behind closed doors that same year, a small internal review was launched within the Department of the Interior. Declassified documents later revealed its name: Project Remnant. The review's goal was to locate and assess potential submerged federal archives of historical significance within Lake Mead. The correspondence between the Interior Department and the National Park Service noted that if such materials were found, the matter shall remain internal to avoid public misinterpretation. Public misinterpretation. That phrase would haunt Merrick for the rest of his career. In 2012, another drought hit. Once again, the ghost town rose. This time, Merrick led a joint expedition with archaeologists, permitted under the National Park Service's Submerged Cultural Research Initiative. They brought magnetometers, ground-penetrating radar, and drones to scan the entire St. Thomas Basin. On the 3rd day, the radar picked up a dense anomaly approximately 15 feet below the old county jail, deeper than typical foundations. Its dimensions matched the size of a small room, 6 by 8 meters, with a metallic reflection signature. When they probed the surface, the instruments registered unusually high gamma readings, low level, but distinct. Not dangerous, but enough to raise eyebrows. That night, Merrick wrote in his journal, "The soil hums. Something below this town is not just history, it's industry." The next morning, the Park Service halted the dig. An order came down from Washington citing safety and contamination concerns. All field activity was suspended indefinitely. Merrick protested, but the site was resealed, and his research permit was revoked within weeks. He was furious. He wrote letters to senators, to the press, to anyone who might listen. Most went unanswered. When a Freedom of Information appeal finally came through in 2014, it included a single redacted memo from the Department of Energy. The unredacted header read, "Subject: Assessment of Residual Isotopic Presence, Lake Mead Substrate, 36 den N, 114-26W." Those coordinates pointed directly to the center of St. Thomas. The revelation was explosive, but Merrick was cautious. He never claimed the government had buried radioactive material beneath the town. Instead, he proposed that the so-called vault might have contained early mineral research related to uranium ore samples from the nearby plateau, material that decades later could register trace isotopic signatures. Still, the implication was hard to ignore. If correct, it meant that before Hoover Dam was even finished, the government had quietly disposed of experimental material under a small Nevada county, then erased it from existence by drowning it. And yet, despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, the official record remained silent. No agency acknowledged any vault, any samples, or any classified operation connected to St. Thomas. In 2016, Merrick released a documentary with a small public television network titled The County That Drowned. The film combined interviews with descendants, historical footage of the dam's construction, and his own findings. It was quiet, somber, and deeply human. But buried within its narration were hints of the larger mystery: aerial reels, metallic boxes, radiation traces, and bureaucratic vanishings. The film drew attention online, sparking renewed interest in the lost county. Amateur historians began visiting the site, using metal detectors and drones of their own. Some claimed to find fragments of steel pipe and rusted hardware deeper than the known foundations. Others said they detected unusual magnetism. Most of it was unverified, but it reignited the question Merrick had been asking for years. What exactly had America hidden under the lake? In the years since, the evidence has continued to surface, slowly, literally. When Lake Mead's water levels reached record lows in 2022, photos circulated of half-buried structures glinting under the Nevada sun. Alongside them were images of long-forgotten artifacts, bottles, tools, even skeletal remains believed to be from the 1930s. The lake was giving up its ghosts one piece at a time. That same year, a journalist named Claire Donovan from the Arizona Republic uncovered an unclassified shipping manifest from the Bureau of Mines dated April 1933. The document listed multiple crates transported from STC Repotizer 14B to Federal Containment Project Boulder Canyon. The contents were described as assay cores and metallic deposits, sealed for controlled study. It was the first official document directly linking the mysterious repository beneath St. Thomas to federal containment operations associated with Hoover Dam. When Donovan's story went public, the Department of the Interior released a carefully worded statement. The department is aware of past geological storage operations predating the construction of Hoover Dam. All materials of concern were evaluated under historical standards and pose no present risk. But buried within that same release was a subtle admission that such materials had indeed existed. The irony wasn't lost on Merrick, now nearing retirement. He said in an interview, "For 80 years, they said there was nothing down there but adobe and mud. Now they admit there was something, but only after it's safe to say it no longer matters." Then he paused. Except it still does. Because the question that haunts historians isn't only what was buried, but why it had to be forgotten. The erasure of St. Thomas County wasn't just collateral damage from progress. It was an act of deliberate concealment, one that transformed geography into secrecy. Somewhere beneath the calm blue surface of Lake Mead, under hundreds of feet of silt and sediment, lies the evidence of how modern America was built, not just through engineering, but through a mission. And every year the water drops, the line between history and memory rises a little higher. Today, if you walk through the exposed ruins at sunset, you can still trace the faint grid of streets where a county once stood. The heat shimmers, the air buzzes with silence, and the cracks in the earth look almost like veins. Visitors describe the feeling as walking through a photograph, real, yet unreachable. But for those who know what's buried below, the experience is heavier. It's not just a ghost town. It's a sealed archive, a place where the country decided that progress was worth more than the truth. As one of Merrick's final lectures put it, history isn't written by the victors, it's written by the survivors. And St. Thomas has been underwater so long, it forgot how to breathe, but it never forgot how to wait. Morning light sweeps across the Mojave, slow and colorless, painting the cracked basin in pale gold. From above, Lake Mead looks serene, an endless stretch of blue pressed between red stone cliffs. But from the air, where the desert winds shift the light, the water isn't calm. It's retreating. Every drought, every year, the lake pulls back another inch, exposing the bones of what it swallowed. By 2023, the old county seat of St. Thomas was almost fully visible again. Dust settled on the adobe ruins, and the sun carved long shadows over the foundations of homes that hadn't felt daylight in 80 years. It was here, amid the silence and shimmer of heat, that the final chapter of this story began. The narrator's tone steadies, the kind you'd hear in a dimly lit documentary booth. History has a strange current. Sometimes it carries secrets farther than any river. Sometimes it brings them back. Dr. Alan Merrick returned that year, older and thinner, moving slower than before. His hair had gone white, and his hands shook when he set up his tripod on what had once been Main Street. Around him, the exposed landscape looked like the aftermath of a long-forgotten war. Walls half collapsed, bricks fused with salt, the smell of algae still lingering in the cracks. He wasn't alone this time. A small team of graduate researchers followed, carrying handheld scanners and drones. Their mission was simple: complete one final survey of the ruins before the lake rose again. But for Merrick, it wasn't just a survey, it was a reckoning. For 2 decades, he had followed a trail of vanished paperwork, erased maps, and half-told stories. And now, for the first time, the ground itself was giving him permission to look closer. They began by mapping the area near the old county jail, the same spot where radar scans a decade earlier had revealed a metallic anomaly. The site was bone dry now. The lake had retreated nearly a mile to the south. When the team brushed away the layers of hardened mud, they uncovered something unmistakable: a rectangular hatch made of corroded steel, set flush into the ground. At first, they thought it was part of the jail's foundation, maybe an old septic line or maintenance shaft. But as they cleared around it, the shape grew clearer: 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, sealed with heavy rivets. There was a faint embossed number along the edge. 14B, the same designation that appeared in the Lost Bureau files. Merrick stood motionless for a moment, his breath shallow. "It's real," he said quietly. "It was here the whole time." They didn't open it that day. The surface was fused shut, and the desert sun made the metal too hot to touch. But they marked the coordinates, recorded the find, and sent the evidence to the Park Service. Within a week, their permit was revoked again. The official explanation was archaeological containment. The site, they said, was too unstable for excavation. But unofficially, the order came from higher up, the Department of the Interior, same as before. The hatch was resealed under a layer of concrete, supposedly to protect it from looting. The team was furious. Merrick wasn't surprised. "They can't bury it with water anymore," he said, "so they'll bury it with bureaucracy." Still, the evidence existed now, not just in rumors or photographs, but in physical, measurable form. The coordinates were logged, the structure documented. It couldn't be erased again without leaving a trace. And as news of the discovery spread online, journalists and historians began to revisit the question that had haunted Lake Mead for nearly a century. What was really sealed beneath St. Thomas County before the flood? To answer that, we have to return to 1932. That year, before the Hoover Dam was even approved by Congress, surveyors from the Bureau of Mines and the U.S. Geological Service were quietly conducting experiments in the Nevada desert. Officially, they were studying mineral samples for dam foundation stability. But internal correspondence, letters that surfaced decades later, hinted at a different motive. One memo from January 1932 mentioned containment of processed residues from Colorado Plateau extractions. Another noted that temporary underground storage under regional jurisdiction shall suffice until federal classification finalization. In plain English, they had byproducts from mineral research, potentially radioactive, definitely untested, and they needed somewhere to hide them. The easiest solution? A remote, cooperative county with little oversight, a county like St. Thomas. At the time, St. Thomas County was small, self-sufficient, and poor. Its leaders wanted federal attention, any project that might bring investment or stability. So when engineers arrived promising geological testing ahead of the dam's construction, the county commissioners approved without hesitation. They didn't know what was being stored beneath their feet. A few months later, as the dam plans accelerated, the Bureau began acquiring land under emergency authorization. The same parcels that hosted those early repositories were quietly transferred to federal ownership. Within 3 years, the floodwaters would erase them entirely. There's no direct evidence of deliberate contamination, no barrels, no warnings, no proof of danger. What does exist, however, are those aerial imaging reels discovered under the courthouse, film that showed a grid of white lines converging around the vault. When digital restoration experts enhanced the images in 2020, they noticed something else. Faint geometric patterns etched into the ground near the storage site. The design wasn't random. It matched early radiation testing arrays used in mining operations during the 1930s. That finding reignited debate among historians. If St. Thomas had been used for mineral containment testing, the flooding of the valley may not have been solely for hydroelectric progress. It could have been a convenient method of permanent disposal. It would mean the nation's most celebrated engineering project doubled as its quietest burial. But truth, like water, refuses to stay still. Following the 2023 exposure of the hatch, pressure mounted for a full investigation. Environmental groups, historical societies, and even former Bureau employees signed petitions demanding transparency. By mid-2024, Congress authorized a limited inquiry under the Historical Preservation and Federal Transparency Act. The inquiry didn't open the vault, but it did uncover hundreds of pages of declassified documents from the Bureau of Mines archives, files never before made public. Among them was a shipping log dated May 19. It listed several crates under escort, moved from the St. Thomas repository to Boulder Canyon for permanent placement. One notation caught researchers' attention: residuals of experiment 42C, secure until submersion complete. No further details were given. But that date, May 1933, was the same month excavation began for Hoover Dam's foundation. And submersion complete could only mean one thing: they intended for the floodwaters to seal it forever. The inquiry's final report, released in 2020, concluded that while there was insufficient evidence of hazardous material disposal, the Bureau had, indeed, utilized the St. Thomas region for classified geological storage operations prior to inundation. In bureaucratic language, that's as close to an admission as the government will ever make. It confirmed that something had been stored there, deliberately, and that its submersion was part of the plan. What remained unanswered was the content of those storage operations. The vault, if it still existed, was entombed under sediment so compacted it might never be opened without destroying it. To some, that was enough. To others, it was proof that a nation can build entire monuments on top of what it chooses not to remember. For Merrick, the story ended where it began, with silence. He retired that same year, moving back to Utah, but he kept one small artifact from his final visit to Lake Mead: a single iron rivet, rusted but intact, that he'd found near the hatch. On its surface were faintly etched numbers, 33-4B. He never deciphered what they meant. Some believe it was part of a serial code. Others think it was simply a manufacturing mark. But Merrick called it the last word from a place that was never supposed to speak again. In interviews before his death, he often described standing on the exposed floor of St. Thomas during dusk, the air dry and still, the horizon glowing orange behind the dam. "It's strange," he said, "to realize that the greatest structure of the 20th century begins with the loss of something smaller. A county, a home, a memory. We built our future on top of what we buried." Today, St. Thomas is a ghost with coordinates. The National Park Service maintains a simple walking trail that winds through the ruins when the water is low enough. Informational plaques tell the official version: settlers, dam, flood, displacement. But locals who live near Overton say you can still see the outlines of streets when the sun hits the mud just right. Some claim they can hear the faint toll of a church bell carried through the canyon wind, a sound impossible to explain, but equally impossible to ignore. In the evenings, when the air cools, the walls of the old schoolhouse glow faintly in the fading light. The silence feels like it's listening. In a broader sense, the story of St. Thomas isn't just about what vanished beneath a lake. It's about how America defines progress. We like to believe that progress is measured in megawatts and milestones, in concrete poured and cities powered. But every blueprint has its shadows. Decisions made quietly, sacrifices unrecorded. St. Thomas was one of them, a test of how much we were willing to forget in order to move forward. The dam became a symbol of American ingenuity, but its lake became a mirror, one that reflects what was lost to make the lights glow in Los Angeles, Phoenix, and beyond. Now, as the water line falls lower each year, that mirror cracks a little more, and through the fissures, the past looks back. The closing montage would show it, plainly. archival footage of workers blasting the canyon in 1933, families loading wagons under a burning Nevada sky. Then the slow, inevitable rise of water swallowing the desert, frame by frame. The narrator's voice softens, steady, almost like prayer. A map can erase a county. A dam can bury its courthouse. But you cannot flood memory. Beneath every great monument to progress, there's a ledger written in silence, and every drought, that silence rises again. If you visit the lake today, you'll find a wooden marker planted in the dry mud. St. Thomas, founded 1865, abandoned 1938. But the truth is more complicated. The county was never officially dissolved by Nevada law. On paper, it still exists, its borders drawn beneath the surface, its jurisdiction suspended underwater. Technically, St. Thomas County is still alive. It's just waiting to breathe again. And maybe that's the haunting beauty of it. Every time the lake recedes, America gets another chance to face what it left behind. Not just the ruins of one forgotten county, but the choices that built the modern West. The balance between ambition and amnesia. As one historian wrote after visiting the ruins, we call it a ghost town, but ghosts only linger when they have something left to tell. The desert wind carries that truth across the basin tonight, through the cracked adobe and rusted iron, over the invisible line where land becomes water. You can almost hear it whisper, soft, insistent, unburied. We were here. We still are. If this story moved you, subscribe for more American historical mysteries, forgotten events, and hidden secrets like this one.